Throughout the Gemara, the issur of Lifnei Iver means one very, very specific thing. Gemara in Avodah, which towards the beginning of the Masechet, says, how do I know that you're not allowed to hand a cup of wine to a Nazir or a aveira min achai to a goy? Where it says that's the pasuk of Lifnei Iver lo titein michshol. In other words, placing a stumbling block is not physically putting a stumbling block, but it's rather helping somebody do an aveira. And throughout Shas, that's the meaning. It's basically helping people and causing them to do aveiras. Rashi on Chumash quotes the Sifra that has a different explanation. Rashi says, Lifnei Iver lo titein michshol, Lifnei hasumad b'davar, someone who is unaware of what's going on. Lo titein eitza she'ena hogenes lo, don't give him bad advice. Don't advise him to sell something where your whole goal is really just to get him to sell it in order that you should come along and purchase it from him. So basically we end up with having two different definitions of Lifnei Iver. First definition, as it appears in most of the Gemara, is helping somebody do an aveira. The explanation of Rashi presents it is to give somebody bad advice. Of course, there was a third possibility, which isn't mentioned really anywhere in Chazal, which is actually physically placing a stumbling block in front of a blind person. And I'll try to explain why that doesn't appear, or maybe it does. But they're the two different explanations. And the question is there any relationship between these two explanations? So there's a fascinating machloket between the Rambam and the Chinuch and the Minchat Chinuch. The Minchat Chinuch, when he quotes begins to discuss the mitzvah or the issur of Lifnei Iver, says, Lo lachshil b'nei Yisrael, lateit lehem eitza ra'ah, אבל אני אשאר אותם כי שאלו עצה במה שנאמין שהוא ישר ועצה טובה. שנאמר לפני עבר לתות מכשול. So he says, don't cause to stumble b'nei Yisrael, Jewish people, by giving them bad advice. So the Sefer HaChinuch here adds, and the Rambam is exactly the same. He adds in something that's never mentioned, that the prohibition of Lifnei Iver only applies to Jews. Comes along Minchas Chinuch and says, I don't understand. The Gemara in Avodah explicitly, one of the two examples the Gemara gave was giving an aveira min achai to a goy, where it's clear that the issur of Lifnei Iver also applies to a goy. So the Minchas Chinuch says, I don't understand, why does the Chinuch limit it to a Jew? So apparently what's going on here is a fundamental machloket between the Sefer HaChinuch on the one hand and the Minchat Chinuch on the other hand, about whether these two issurim, that of giving bad advice and that of helping someone do aveira, are two different worlds, and they have different rules and different klalim, or we're thinking it's the same issur, just two different expressions of it. The Minchat Chinuch assumes at the end of the day, there's one issur, and the issur has the same rules, whether it's talking about giving bad advice or it's about causing someone to do an aveira. Whereas the Sefer HaChinuch and the Rambam apparently make a very, very clear distinction between these two different types of Lifnei Iver. So if we think about it, there's really a double machloket between them all. There's a machloket about giving bad advice, whereas the Rambam, the Sefer HaChinuch say it only applies to Jews. The Minchat Chinuch assumes it applies to non-Jews as well. But apparently there's also a fundamental machloket about the nature of causing someone to do aveira. There, everyone agrees it applies to a non-Jew. But the fact that the Minchat Chinuch assumes it's similar to giving bad advice reveals a fundamentally different understanding of what this aveira is. So let's try and understand bit by bit what's going on. According to Minchat Chinuch, we're looking for one common denominator, one definition that immediately include within it both giving bad advice and to assist somebody to do an aveira. And apparently what the Minchat Chinuch assumes is that Lifnei Iver is a prohibition on causing bad to somebody else, causing damage to somebody else. Just there are various different ways to do so. One way is to give them bad advice. Another way is to assist them to an aveira. Somebody helping them do aveira is helping somebody do something which is very damaging to them, spiritually damaging. Giving bad advice can be physically damaging. Helping them do aveira is spiritually damaging. According to Minchat Chinuch, it's all one and the same. You are helping somebody do something bad to them, and it's prohibited to do that, and it's prohibited even to a non-Jew. If you take that approach, so it seems obvious that you should probably include placing a stumbling block, physical stumbling block in front of a blind person. That's what the Minchas Chinuch assumes later on in his piece. It's also the Meshech Chochmah says so. And you could take it even further. The Yad Ramah, when dealing with a famous question, is it actually a prohibition on causing damage to a person? We have a whole Masechet, entire Masechet Bava Kama, dedicated to the halachas of what happens once a person has caused damage to somebody else. Is that actually a prohibition to cause damage? Says the Yad Ramah, yes, that's the pasuk of Lifnei Iver lo titei mechshol. In other words, the Yad Ramah, and apparently also the Meshech Chochmah and Minchas Chinuch, they're all assuming that the definition of Lifnei Iver is to cause damage to another person. And there are many, many ways to do so, and all of them are prohibited due to the pasuk of Lifnei Iver. What about the Rambam? So, first of all, the Rambam assumes that we're dealing with two separate issurim. And the prohibition of helping somebody do aveira is not like giving them bad advice. Apparently it's not about somehow damaging them and hurting them. So here there's a very instructive machloket between the Rishonim, between the Ramban and the Bala Ma'or, and the Ran, about cases of Yarag v'Yal Yavo. Where a person has to give up his life instead of doing so, the big three aveiras, avodah zarah, gilaras, and shvichas damim. So the Bala Ma'or and the Ran have a machlokes. What happens about causing someone else to do avodah zarah? Does a person have to give up his life in order to not be over the issue of Lifnei Iver, where what you're doing is causing someone else to do avodah zarah? So the Bala Ma'or says yes, and the Ran says no. What's really lying behind the question? Apparently, the Bala Ma'or assumes that the nature of Lifnei Iver takes on the nature of the aveira that you're causing somebody to do. So what's problematic in causing somebody to do avodah zarah is that somehow you're getting involved in avodah zarah. And that'll be true of every single aveira. What's the problem with giving an aveira menachai to a goy? Because you're getting involved in his aveira. The problem isn't the damage you're doing to him as a person. It's not an issa bein adam lechavero. It's an issa bein adam lemakom. It's asa for me to cause aveiras in the world, both personally, directly, when I do the aveira, but it's also asa to me to be involved in somebody else's aveira. And it's issa bein adam lemakom. Therefore, the Bala Ma'or says, not only do I have to give up my life not to do avodah zarah myself, I have to give my life if it involves causing someone else to do avodah zarah. The Ran argues. There are a number of reasons why the Ran could argue, but one simple explanation is he holds, like Minchas Chinuch, the issue of Lifnei Iver is not a take on the nature. It's not about causing aveiras and being involved in the aveira. It's about causing him damage, helping him do a certain aveira. So he did the aveira. I just caused him damage by helping him do whatever aveira he did. But the nature of my aveira is not like the nature of his aveira. So it seemed that the Rambam agrees to the approach of the Bala Ma'or, that what we're dealing here in Lifnei Iver is not an issa bein adam l'chaveiro, but an issa bein adam l'makom, and there is a sharp, clear difference between the two types of Lifnei Iver. Giving bad advice is an issa bein adam l'chaveiro. Helping somebody do aveira is an issa bein adam l'makom. Another example of this question: is there an issa Lifnei Iver on an issa d'Rabbanan? So the Gemara in avodah zarah talks about the prohibition to lease a field to another person, a Jew, who's going to do a melacha in that field on Chol HaMoed. And the Gemara says the problem of Lifnei Iver. Since I enabled him to do malach on Chol HaMoed, so it's asa for me to be an enabler. Tosfot there says, 1 second, the issa of doing malach on Chol HaMoed is an issa d'Rabbanan. So you see from this Gemara that even to cause somebody to do an issa d'Rabbanan is included in Lifnei Iver. The Ramban starts on the opposite angle. He says it's obvious that Lifnei Iver doesn't apply to an issa d'Rabbanan. It only applies to isserei d'oraita. So it must be that doing melach on Chol HaMoed is a d'oraita. What lies behind the machloket around about Lifnei Iver? So if causing somebody to do an aveira is a problem of causing them to damage themselves, then there's no real reason to make a difference between an issa d'oraita or an issa d'Rabbanan. I'm causing him to damage himself. So even if I cause him to do an issa d'Rabbanan, that act of Lifnei Iver is really asur min haTorah, because doing something asur min d'Rabbanan is also damaging. So the person who causes somebody to do an issa d'Rabbanan is himself over an issa d'oraita. That's apparently what Tosfot holds. Whereas the Ramban apparently argues and says no, since the whole issa is being involved in his aveira, so if he's doing an aveira doraita, then my Lifnei Iver would be an Isser doraita. His aveira is a derabanan. The my Lifnei Iver is either only derabanan or even less. Maybe it doesn't even exist. So it seems that that's really a soda machloket between the Rambam and the Minchas Chinuch about the nature of causing somebody to do an aveira. What about the Isser causing Eitzer Ra'ah, of giving Eitzer Ra'ah, of giving bad advice? So here you have a much more subtle machloket. The Minchas Chinuch says, you're damaging a person, you're causing them damage, there's no reason to make a distinction between a Jew and a non-Jew. Whereas the Rambam and the Sefer Chinuch limit it to Jews. And that's strange. Normally when we're dealing with something about being horrible to somebody, being bad, or doing something which is objectively bad, so it should apply equally to a Jew or a non-Jew. Just like the Isser to murder or the Isser to steal applies equally to a Jew and a non-Jew. Why should giving bad advice be any different? So we have a general principle here that the Ramban al Torah teaches us when he discusses ribbit. Ribbit, as we know, only applies to a Jew. The Isser of charging interest applies to a Jew and not to a non-Jew. Says the Ramban, why is that true? He says, technically, legally, financially, a person has all the right in the world to charge ribbit. He gave somebody his money. He hasn't got use of that money for a period of time. He has a right to ask for extra payment back for the use of that money. And that's ribbit. Ribbit is legally and ethically totally acceptable. Why then did the Torah prohibit ribbit? Because the Torah expects amongst brothers, amongst fellow Jews, that will do an act of chesed. And giving a free loan is an act of chesed expected of every Jew to every other Jew. And since what we're dealing with is an expectation of chesed, therefore, it only applies between Jews. And it doesn't apply to a non-Jew, because we're not doing something which is intrinsically bad. If we take the same principle, we have to apply it also to giving bad advice. Surely giving bad advice is a terrible thing, and it shouldn't be done to a non-Jew either. But if we read the Sefer Chinuch very carefully, it seems that the Isser isn't just giving bad advice. He says, "Lo lechshil b'nei Yisrael take lehem eitzer ra'ah." You shouldn't give them bad advice. Aval niyasher otam kishishalu eitza. You should straighten them up when they request advice. On that which you believe is to be good advice. And later on in the Shorish HaMitzvah, he says the same idea. The way to fix the world. The whole prohibition of Lifnei Iver, according to the Sefer Chinuch, and it's explicit like this way in the Rambam as well, the whole yesod of the Isser is the expectation to give good advice. Giving advice, at the end of the day, there's no guarantee the person will follow what you tell them. But if somebody asks your advice, then there is an expectation that you would give them good advice. That's a chesed, that it's expected of us. And since what we're dealing with is a chesed of giving good advice, so the specific prohibition of Lifnei Iver only applies where that expectation exists amongst Jews, but does not exist to non-Jews. Giving bad advice is always bad, and it shouldn't be done to non-Jews. But the specific prohibition is only between Jews. There might be another approach in which we'll finish. The Rashi's example is fascinating. Rashi's example is don't give him bad advice, which it doesn't say bad advice. Advice which isn't suitable for him. Don't say to him, sell this field, and then you go and buy it from him. Now there are many, many other examples in the Sifra, which Rashi is based on, of Eitzara. Somebody asks you, shall I marry this person? And they have bad yichus, but you advise them to do so anyway. Somebody says, when should I go on a journey? And you tell them, go on a journey at a certain time, and you know it's a bad time to go on a journey. There's going to be bandits, or it's going to be too hot. You gave them objectively bad advice. But in the example of Rashi, there's nothing objectively bad about advising somebody to sell a field or to sell a chamor or to buy a chamor. You basically, selling something or buying something could be very simply reasonable advice. What's the problem according to Rashi? The problem isn't that the advice was bad. The problem is when somebody asks advice, and we're giving advice, there should only be one priority, one goal in our minds. And that's to think, what's best for this person? And the problem, according to Rashi, is taking advantage of somebody. Somebody asks you advice, and instead of giving them the advice which is best for them, you take advantage of them, and you give an advice which is actually good for us and not good for them. According to Rashi, that's the essential problem here with Lifnei Iver. We're not even necessarily bad advice. Bad advice, that's also, of course that's also. But even giving advice which isn't fundamentally bad, but it's not in their best interest, that's already included in the issue of Lifnei Iver. If that's true, once again, it makes sense that it should be limited or could be limited just to Jews.